We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and into the first verse of chapter 7. Actually, we're not going to get there, but that's where we theoretically are. And this brings us to the end of this large section of 2 Corinthians, which we've called the Great Digression, as Paul began to talk about being in Macedonia and waiting for Titus to come. And then all of a sudden, he breaks in with thanks be to God who always leads us in triumph in Christ Jesus. And he talks about the new covenant ministry from chapter 2, verse 14, all the way to chapter 7, verse 4, or some people divided it verse 3 or verse 1, it doesn't matter. But all of that section is really Paul moving off in another kind of discussion. He'd been talking in the early chapters about his relationship with the Corinthian Christians and some of the challenges of that and the relationships to it, the suffering he'd endured. And then he breaks off. He's gone on this long discussion. And as we're going to see as we get into next week, the last part, he now begins to shift back. And all of a sudden, he's back in Macedonia with Titus, arriving where he's been waiting from him. And this is kind of the end, but it's also, in some ways, the climax about what has been on your, the burr under your saddle all the way through here, Paul. What is it that's causing you such concern? And this passage gives us some of the evidence of that. So what I want to do tonight is largely talk about the background to this passage and some of the things related to it. But let's take the time, obviously, to read it as we look at God's Word. So 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And verse 11. Sorry, having trouble getting things organized up here. So I've chosen to include verses 11 to 13. The Bible I have in front of me, the English Standard Version, puts it in an earlier paragraph, but it really goes in this part, as we'll see in a moment. We've spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you're restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children, widen your hearts also. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. Now, that long section from the middle of verse 14 or down to the end is about 6 different Old Testament passages that Paul has woven together. And next week we'll go and look at those. Since we have these promises, therefore, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, bringing holiness to completion in the fear of God. Make room in your hearts for us. We've wronged no one. We've corrupted no one. We've taken advantage of no one. I do not say this to condemn you, for I've said before that you are in our hearts to die together and to live together. I'm acting with great boldness toward you. I have great pride in you. I'm filled with comfort in all of our affliction. I'm overflowing with joy. So let's just notice, as I've given the title on the outline, you can see right at the top of the page, the New Covenant calls for a decisive break with idolatry and paganism. So that's kind of the major theme, but just to notice the structure of what we've just read. Verses 11 to 13, Paul makes an appeal to the Corinthians, our hearts open wide to you. Open your hearts too. So he begins with an appeal. Then all of a sudden, very abruptly, verse 14, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. So he moves from appeal to exhortation or command, and that runs down to chapter 7, verse 1, and then he moves back to appeal again. So if you look at the end of verse 13, widen your hearts also. Verse 2 of chapter 7, make room in your hearts for us. We've wronged no one. And those two seem to flow right together. You could almost put 7:2 right at the end of chapter 6, verse 13, but instead Paul's dropped this other part right in the middle as a kind of abrupt change. So we'll come back to that, but just to understand that's how this passage fits together in terms of its overview. Now, I want to think with a little bit about, because we'll understand the issues that are going on here, about what it meant to be a Christian and dealing with the issue of idolatry. So you'll notice under that heading on your outline, I have 4 things to say, and we can talk about these. But what was it like to become a Christ follower? You're living in Corinth, one of the metropolis cities of the ancient world, the kind of city where what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. It was a playground on one side, it was prosperous, it was significantly located. All of those things were true of it, and then you begin to follow Christ. So I just want to notice 4 things to help us think into this and understand what he's saying, and then we can apply it much more readily. First of all, Christianity was viewed as inherently strange. Now, what I mean by that is, and it doesn't take us long, to believe in a crucified criminal as the central object of your worship is on any standard of it, not what you expect. I mean, imagine for the first time, we're brought up to hear that, and we know all about it. But imagine going in and saying, you know, there was a criminal in Israel who was crucified, and we believe he's God's sent one. Matter of fact, we believe he's God come to earth. And then related to that is they not only believed in a crucified Messiah, but also in his bodily resurrection. And the Greeks had no use for the body. The body was the prison house of the soul, so to die and get rid of your body was a good thing. Resurrection was not something that was part of their desire or looking forward at. You were freed from the prison house. So to come in and preach the message, of the gospel, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and he was buried, and he rose again the 3rd day according to the scriptures, it was inherently strange, and Paul recognized that. He came into the city, he says, in fear and trembling, and he said, we preach Christ crucified. To the Greek a stumbling block, and to the Greek foolishness, to the Gentiles foolishness, and to the Jews a stumbling block. How could that possibly be true? So the inherent strangeness of that was one part. The second part was, it was based on beliefs and not rituals and actions. Pagan religion didn't really care what you believed about the gods. What they cared about was that you followed the rituals, that you went in and you offered the incense and you kept certain days in honor of those particular gods. And the third thing that made Christianity strange was that it was inherently strange. It was based on belief and not just practices. And it was exclusive. Now the Jews they had rights on their own. And they were very strange for believing in monotheism. But the essence of ancient religion was that there were all kinds of gods, and you had your gods, and our family has their gods, and this country has their gods, and you're loyal to your God, but if another God can do something for you, then go to his temple and go through the ritual. And there was no problem with adding another god onto their roster of gods. That was not a problem. It was when you said there was only one God and there was an exclusivity to your faith, that was the great scandal that early Christianity faced. Nobody was concerned that you were preaching Jesus. But when you say Jesus, although the strangeness of it would have struck them, but this is the only God, and all other gods were false gods. So that was the inherent strangeness, that it just didn't fit in any particular way. Secondly, Christianity was seen as un-Roman. It was seen as a foreign superstition. Now, it was foreign in several ways. First of all religions in the world at that time were either racially based, if you were of this race, you believe this, tribally based, culturally based, or family based. So you had your family god, you may have a tribal god, you may have a national god, but there were all kinds of gods in that particular way, and you were loyal to your god of origin, small g. And you would often have a family shrine where you worshiped in that particular way. And that was just the way things went. I read something this morning, and I meant to copy it out and just reminded myself right now, which is always really annoying. But it was about the two fundamental ideas of African religion, just in general. And one of them was that you need to take care of your God and your family God and the spirits. And keeping them happy was one of the central things that you needed to do. Now, when a person becomes a Christian and they refuse to keep the family gods happy, well, that's the second thing that comes into this, because the purpose of religion, it was non-physical. I should go back on what I was going to say. It was inherently strange. It was un-Roman, first of all, because it was not racially based. It was non-physical. It had no temple, no idols, nothing evident behind it. You're worshiping the invisible God in a non-visible way. It was private in its practice, not public like the temples. Everybody else had temples. They had things that were out in public. They didn't have walls. Christians met privately. They didn't do whatever they did publicly, which led in the 2nd century to all kinds of scandals that were suggested about what went on behind closed doors when Christians met together. And then it was, as I said, exclusive. And it was exclusive, so one of the main things that the Christians were called, was atheists. Now that seems very strange to us. How could you call Christians atheists? Because they didn't believe in the gods. So away with the atheists was one of the terms that was used when mob would break out in attacking Jesus. In attacking early Christians in different places. Third, and I've already said some of this sort of off balance, but Christianity was considered socially dangerous. And that really seems strange to us, but it was viewed as socially dangerous. Why? Because Roman religion was intended to stabilize the political order. And if you could get all the peoples to worship the same God, which became, toward the end of the 1st century and the 2nd century, the Roman emperor, who was viewed as God, that stabilized the social order. And pleasing the gods would bring prosperity. But these Christians were displeasing the gods. They wouldn't offer sacrifices. They wouldn't offer prayers. They wouldn't offer the various incenses in the honor of these particular gods. And so the gods might be upset. So they were viewed as turning the world upside down because their displeasing the gods affected the social impact. When Elizabeth and I were in Malaysia, I'm not sure how many years ago now, we had the privilege when we were on one little island where we were ministering there, to have the opportunity to interact with a number of people, and a lot of them were really new Christians. And the interesting story that came up over and over, well, how did you become a Christian? Well, I went to the United States or to Canada for university. And they met some Christians in university. And they came to know Christ, and they came to faith, and they were baptized. Then they went back home. And the big issue was back home was, how do I tell my parents that I'm not going to offer pieces of food to the family gods? Because Chinese traditional religion, as we saw it there was all these little idol things, or what would you call them, a little bit small little sanctuary things at the front of all the houses where they would go and they would put food in to feed the gods. And I remember more than one of them saying how traumatic it was for them to have to tell their parents that they did not believe in the gods, that they were following Jesus, and they would not follow these customs. And their parents believed that their well-being after death depended on how you dealt with them when you died. So you mean now you're not going to do a funeral for me? Yeah, we'll do the funeral. No, I mean, are you going to offer those sacrifices to appease the gods? Because otherwise my spirit will not be allowed to leave, and it will roam. Now you try and explain to a parent, why you're not going to do those kind of things. Well, to become a Christian in Corinth were these similar kind of things. You're not any longer going to the temple of our family God, and you're not appeasing them. That has effects on all of our family. Now, related to that was the fact that all of life was related to religion in a shallow kind of way. I can remember when we moved to Dallas, and I mean, I'd known about this, but when you'd go to a Friday night high school football game, and I know it's done here at the Christian schools, but these are just normal state schools, and they're praying before the game, and everybody bows their head. And I can remember thinking, this is so strange to me. What is all this ritual about? Bless us as our kids beat their heads in down there on the field, kind of thing. I don't want to. But that's the way, and that's just woven into the culture, especially in the South in this country, that you pray before games, even if it's state schools playing one another. That's changing, obviously, with certain kind of pressures. But that's the way it was there. If you were a member of a guild, and you couldn't have certain jobs unless you were a member of a guild. It was a kind of union. And the unions would have their guild meetings in a temple and offer sacrifices for the well-being of the guild. Your family had its God. The nation had its God. The city had its God. And in all of those ways, they needed to have sacrifices made to them and all of these other things. So an early Christian writer called Mincius Felix was in a debate with the pagan, and the pagan says, you deny yourselves wholesome pleasures. You don't attend the shows, because the shows were done related to the temple. You take no part in the processions, because the processions were, I'm adding in that part. You fight shy of public banquets, because that's where, again, sacrifices were made. You abhor the sacred games. The Olympics and the Corinthian games would be done in the names of the gods. You abhor meat from the victims, that is, from sacrifices, drinks poured in libation on the altars. So frightened are you of the gods, whom you deny, as if they were abstaining because they were afraid of those particular gods and didn't get involved with them. So Christians, by refusing to do their civic religious duties, were potentially invoking the wrath of the gods. And if they didn't follow the religious, the duties of the particular areas of life, they were not accepted within that guild. And in a family level, you were endangering the family's well-being. So at every level of life, the issue of what does a Christian do with idols and with paganism, following Christ changed and put everything upside down in that particular way. Fourth one, and this is on a different level, but paganism also supplied some alluring enticements, is the term that came to me as I was thinking about that. The food was the food you bought in the temples. The women who worked professionally were related to the temples in terms of the things that they had for sale. The most enjoyable of entertainments, the theater or sports or whatever, that was involved in idolatry. And the best social and economic opportunities were involved in idol worship. At every point in life as a Christian, you were confronted with idols and idolatry as part of what was going on. So how do you live this out? What does it look like to be a Christ follower? So let me just notice under this next one, the Corinthian church and the problem of idols. I'll just make a few points here and then we can stop and have some discussion. So first, Corinth was an intensely Roman city, having officially adopted Roman values, Roman law, Roman institutions, Roman cultural values. It wedded Greek religion and Roman religion and temples. As I've already said, paganism was deeply interwoven with the fabric of daily life. In 1 Corinthians, we discover that many who'd become followers, and it's interesting that this did not happen in the same way in Thessalonica. If you remember 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, I think it's verse 9, says, they reported, you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven. And even in the book of Galatians, the issue in Galatians is about Judaism, not paganism, as the great challenge. So on one level you have the challenge of Judaism and pulling people into law keeping. On the other you had paganism, and that's the great challenge in Corinth in specific ways. So we see it coming up, the issue of food offered to idols, in chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians and chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, and it's worth thinking about that last passage just to hear how Paul says what he wants them to hear in verse in verse 14. He says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there's one bread, we who are many are one body, for we are all partakers of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I don't want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord, almost certainly referring to the communion, and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than they? So in chapter 8, the issue was, can you eat food offered to idols? And he walks through that. And then in chapter 10, it's, well, what about going into a temple and being involved in a meal on that occasion? In chapter 6, the issue is different. And the issue in chapter 6 is about sexual immorality and not being involved, at least in part, with temple prostitutes who were part of what the the background of life in that particular way is. So the whole issue of what our relationship to paganism ought to be as Christ followers had been a live issue. So that's one side of the coin. Then the other side of the coin, and let's just walk our way through this. Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 for a minute. I wrote to you, verse 9, 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy, or swindlers, or idolaters, since then you would have to go out of the world. No, I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he's guilty of sexual immorality or greed or is an idolater. So Paul is saying there, you've got to break off relationships with idolatrous Christians, but not idolaters in and of themselves. So I'm not saying that you withdraw from that. Chapter 7, verse 12. To the rest, and he's talking now about, in the context of marriage, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any wife has a husband who's an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of the wife. The unbelieving wife is made holy because of the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it were, they're holy. That has all kinds of fascinating sub-issues. But you'll notice later in that same chapter, down in verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband lives, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So you have this interesting thing. If you're married to an unbeliever, then you're to stay in the marriage. As long as they're willing, you stay in the marriage. But if you're thinking of marriage, you're not to marry an unbeliever. You can only marry in the Lord. Chapter 10, verse 27. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go, go. Eat whatever's set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then don't eat it for the sake of the one who has informed you. And then over to chapter 14. And verse 22. So he says, thus tongues are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers, while prophecy is a sign not for unbelievers, but for believers. If, therefore, the whole church comes together, and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you're out of your mind? But if all prophesy and an unbeliever or outsider enters, he's convicted by all, he's called to account by all, the secrets of his heart are disclosed, and falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. So Paul has said, just to put sort of all these pieces together, there are relationships with unbelievers you are not to have, but that doesn't mean you're not to have relationships with unbelievers. And a believer must stay married to an unbeliever if the unbeliever is willing. You can have social interaction with unbelievers. Unbelievers are welcome to come into your church meetings and see what's going on in that particular occasion. And so you could see the complexity of what Paul is trying to say. And out of that, he's going to come back now to chapter 6 and verse 14, which we're not going to get to right immediately, and to say, don't be in a mixed relationship, in a mixed yoke with unbelievers. So behind what he's been saying is this issue of paganism and a Christian's involvement in paganism. And there's all kinds of questions that we're immediately wanting to run with. What does that look like? What does it mean? And I just want to make sure we've got some sort of feeling for the ground. I think next week we'll be in a position to sort of try and think through more clearly what Paul is talking about in this particular occasion. But he ends up giving us a general principle, not specific guidelines. And our culture is built on a different basis, and yet it applies in that particular way as well. So let me just see, on the basis of what I've said, if there's any discussion that we want to have, or any questions you have, or any insight that, or things that we should be thinking about.
I have two questions. The Jews were also monotheists, so were they considered atheists?
The Jews had, the Jews had a legal standing. It had been granted to them as they were a recognized religion. They were viewed as strange and unusual, but they were just considered Jews. Anti-Semitism's been a long disease, so they were kind of put in that category. And the early Christians, that's what happens in Acts chapter 18 in Ephesus, when there's a riot led by the goldsmiths related to the temple of Diana. And the ruler gets up and the proconsul Gallo, I think is his name if I recall right, ends up saying, this is internal business within you Jews. So at that point, Christians were in some way regarded, they had some civil rights in terms of their contact with Judaism. But then the Jews were turning against the Christians, so they're going to be caught in between these two. The Jews didn't want to have anything to do with them, and the Gentiles see them as a strange Roman a strange foreign superstition. So.
And then the other question was, how were these gods generated? I know you said that there were tribal gods and national gods. And you mentioned family gods. Is this like ancestry worship? Are people making these up to control the masses? Does this go back to post-flood?
In some cultures, sometimes they were worshiping ancestral spirits. It differs in each one. But a member of a family can have a blessing when they prayed to a certain god, and they begin to consider that's the God to whom we go. He's our, or her, she's our go-to goddess or god in that particular way. So how families came to adopt them, probably came in all kinds of different ways.
Do we know, because post-flood it was just Noah and his family, when did all of this polytheism enter into everything after that?
Pretty soon. Paul says in Romans chapter 1 that they turned the image of the invisible God into something that they could worship and handle. So, even Abraham is called, he was worshiping the moon before that. So, I don't know, you could probably go back and think of maybe the first objects of other religion were the heavenly beings, and so even a lot of the Roman gods and so forth are related to the different ones. In Canaanite religion, they were fertility gods, so fertility mattered for physical procreation, but also for harvests. And so Baal was the storm god, and there was all the mythology, and you prayed so you have a good harvest and those kind of things. So I think there were natural kinds of ways. I don't know all the ways in which they are arisen, but there's never been a culture on earth found anywhere that wasn't worshiping something or
That's intriguing to me. I'm wondering, do you believe that there was demonic activity behind this encouraging them, or were they just...
No, I think that's what Paul says when in the passage we read he said, we know these gods are nothing. In chapter 8, there's only one God. These are false gods. But then in chapter 10, he says, but behind them there are demonic powers. So, yeah, there were...
So they were manifesting somehow.
So they were false gods, but that doesn't mean there weren't supernatural dealing or realities that were engaged in that.
Gary, this idea of unequally yoked, did that relate not only to marriage, but to business? And even in business, I work in a secular organization. Am I considered unequally yoked? I mean, how?
Actually, I don't think in nearly always when we think of this, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers, we think of marriage first. I think that was a long way. Paul clearly believed that. That's why I read the passage, 1 Corinthians 7, was it 39 or 40, or the second last verse in the chapter. But I don't think he was thinking about marriage primarily when he writes this here. It's all of these other kinds of things. And so that's where I think we should do some talking next week. But because he doesn't give us specifics. He gives this general principle. And so let me hold that one a little bit. I'm not trying to skip it because it's an important question, but okay, let's just push a little bit further. Time's catching us here. But so what Paul, before he does that, is makes this appeal. So we're back in 2 Corinthians, urging them, because the challenge is, if you look at verse 1 of chapter 6, working together with God, then we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. So in that context, he was appealing that they be rightly related to God. But now in chapter 11, we've spoken freely to you, Corinthians, our hearts wide open. So, and this theme is going to come up through the rest of chapter 7. We've been frank. We've spoken honestly. Our mouths have been open, which is a Hebrew way of saying we've talked freely. We have not been duplicitous. We haven't refused to say, but our hearts are open to you. It's interesting in that verse. We've spoken freely to you, Corinthians. There's only 3 times in the New Testament or in Paul's writings where he speaks like this. He'll tell you to the church in Corinth. But once he says to the Galatians, you stupid Galatians, in chapter 3 and verse 1. And then in chapter 4, verse 15, in a very different note, he speaks to the Galatians, as you Philippians know. And there's a kind of connectedness by using that. Normally you'd say beloved or something like this. But here he wants them to know he's speaking very directly to them. And he says, our hearts are open to you. And on the other side, that's not being reciprocated. So he comes back and he's complaining. You're not restricted by us. The word has about it the idea of constricted, shut up, narrow. But you are constricted by your own affections. You are bound up. By the way, this is one of those interesting passages. I copied it today because this one was one of those. I used to hear people say, and I was brought up hearing about the value of the King James Version, and I'm grateful for the King James Version. But one of the problems with the King James Version is English has changed so much. So listen to these words. Look at verses 11 to 13 again, and I'll read them again. We've spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children. Open or widen your hearts also. Here's the King James Version of that. O ye Corinthians, our mouth is open unto you. Our heart is enlarged. Ye are not straitened in us, but you are straitened in your own bowels. Now for a recompense, in the same, I speak as to my children, be ye also enlarged. And I dare anybody just to take that those 3 verses without any context and say, what is that? It's just a sign of how much English has changed in its language. Anyway, Paul is really then saying, open up. You shut in, and part of it's the criticism, and part of it's the fear, and we'll see that as it unravels in this particular way. But he's talking to them. Oh, and by the way, when it says in verse 13, in return, I speak as to children, he's not saying that in a mocking way. He's saying that as a father. I'm speaking to my children. I'm speaking to you because you're my spiritual children. So it's a pastoral statement, not a condescending statement, you stupid little kids kind of thing. No, he's saying, because I am your father in Christ. I'm the one who's helped you come to faith and believe in that. So now we come to verse 14. And all of a sudden, out of this, open your heart to us, bang, this abrupt shift in tone and this direct and uncompromising command that he gives to them. And I think the only way you can make sense of this is that this has been the lingering issue that he's wanted to get to at this particular time. You are compromised. And you can't open your heart because you're compromised, and you're compromised with paganism. And that's stealing your heart, so you can't open to me because you're open to idols. And you don't want to let go of what's going on out in that larger world. So I'm going to close with just, let's look at when he says, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Now, the word literally is, don't be other yoked with unbelievers. And the issue isn't so much that the yoke is unequal, it is that it is mixed. You're putting 2 things together that don't belong together. So it's not the inequality of it in terms of the one has more power than the other. It's that you're trying to yoke something, and they're different, fundamentally different in nature. And there are 2 passages in the Old Testament that are in his mind. Leviticus chapter 19. And in verse I always hate it when I do this, and 19:19. I have 9, but I said it's 19:19. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. Nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of 2 kinds of material. Now, throughout chapter 19, there are all these distinctions between don't mix what is unmixable. And in the context of Matthew chapter 19, it's because you are a holy people. And one of the ways the Lord taught them they were to be holy was to institute the principle of separateness all the way through in terms of the way they related to one another, and even mixing 2 kinds of material. So all of us are violating the Old Testament here tonight, I'm sure, because we've got more than 2 kinds or more than 1 kind of material on our body. That was a way of trying to say you cannot mix with the Gentiles. You are to stay who you are. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, he gives the law in terms of the agricultural part of this. And it's again maintaining your identity. So in verse 9, which is an interesting verse in our culture, a woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak. For whoever does these things is an abomination to Yahweh your God. And the point there is as of mixing genders. Again, that's an interesting. If you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs and the mother sitting, and it goes on talking about that. Where's the verse that I'm looking for here? Down to verse 9. You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest the whole field be forfeited. The crop that you've sown and the yield of the vineyard. And you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear cloth of wool and linen mixed together. You shall make yourselves tassels on the four corners of your garment, with which you cover yourself, which was again a sign of their distinctiveness. But it's the mixed nature of this relationship that is the central issue. And obviously a believer, and this is going to become very clear in what he follows, having said, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, or do not be in a mixed yoke with unbelievers. He follows with 7 rhetorical questions. How can you do this? How can you do that? So anyway, we're going to stop there, and we'll get into the meat of it against that background. But it's really helpful, in my mind at least, to try and enter into the culture of that time and to think of what that is. And there are brothers and sisters in many parts of the world. For example, when I was in Africa, talking to the big issue for kids was that if you were going to be initiated into the tribe, you had to go out into a camp, a jungle camp, and be out there and be initiated into all the rituals of the paganism of that particular tribe. If you didn't do that, you were not considered a member of the tribe. But if you did do that, you were initiated into demonism and spiritism. So how does a Christian navigate that kind of situation? How do you live that out? And so that's behind that. But in our context, we're not in those precise situations, and yet there are many kinds of situations where you think, can a Christian be involved in? Anyway, that's Bruce's question for next week. He's going to come up with an answer for us between now and then.